Kristol, when did you decide you wanted to be in the public arena?
I'm not sure I ever decided, it sort of happened. I was teaching at Harvard, and my friend Bill Bennett, acquaintance really, Bill Bennett, got offered the education secretaryship by Ronald Reagan. He called me up a little while later and said, why don't you come down for a year to Washington and help me write some speeches, do that sort of thing. And Susan and I discussed it, and we had one little kid, another one on the way. It was a pretty good time. No one in school yet. A pretty good time to move. I didn't think my prospects at the Kennedy School at Harvard for tenure were that great, so I thought it'd be interesting to see what Washington was like. And we came for a year, and 1 year became 2, and 2 years became 20, so here we are.
How long did you teach at Harvard?
I taught for 2 years at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, after teaching 5 years in the political science department at the University of Pennsylvania. So I had 7 years as a young academic, and I guess I decided at the end of that I wasn't really cut out to be a scholar. I respect scholars, I admire scholars, I'm just not one.
When you were at the Kennedy School, were you out of step with the rest of the place?
Yeah, I was the token conservative there. They like to have one at all times. It's useful for the students to know what one looks like when they get out and have to look for a job or something. But they treated me fine. The Kennedy School is a very sort of a pleasant place and respectful of diversity of opinions, at least it was then, and I think it still is now. And I enjoyed the 2 years there. But it wasn't, ultimately, the idea was to bring in someone who taught political theory, political philosophy, to these public policy students at the Kennedy School to sort of deepen their understanding of the issues. But I was a little bit of a fish out of water, and as I say, though it was pleasant, it wasn't really going anywhere.
How did you become Alan Keyes' roommate?
I became Alan Keyes' roommate because we were in graduate school together, and graduate students need to need to share apartments because we were poor, and we liked each other. And so 3 of us, Alan and Steve Rosen, who now teaches at Harvard, and I roomed together for a year, and I guess that was my first year in graduate school, 1973, 1974. We were all students in the government department at Harvard together.
How hard was it for him to talk you into running his campaign for the Senate in, what, 88?
That was in 88. Well, we had stayed in touch. We were friends. He had served in the State Department. I had come to Washington to work for Bennett. Bill it was near the end of the Reagan administration. Bill, in fact, left a few months later also, and Alan got drafted kind of late to run for the Senate in Maryland. I think the original candidate dropped out for some reason, and Alan said, look, so this will be interesting. I don't think, probably won't win, but we have an outside shop, but you'll learn about politics, and it'll be fun. And it was fun, actually. It was a little harrowing, but, running an underfunded campaign against a popular incumbent, Paul Sarbanes, and we lost. But we didn't do any worse than the preceding candidate had done against Sarbanes, or than the succeeding candidate did against Sarbanes. In fact, it was Alan Keyes' best electoral performance ever. He got 38% of the vote in that Senate race in Maryland. And 4 years later, I think he got 27% of the vote, and he drew the logical conclusion from that if you're getting 38% of the vote and 27% of the vote in Senate races, you should then run for president. So then he did that a couple of times.
Did you find the two of you falling away on politics at all during this process? Did you change your mind about the two of you have different points of view?
Well, I think in '88 we were both supporters of Ronald Reagan. The conservatives were united in being Reaganites then. I think so we didn't have many differences. Over the years we've had some differences. We're in cordial terms, but I don't know that we agree on as many policy issues now as we did back then.
Who was the first person to write that you were Quayle's brain?
I think that was in the New Republic. Was it Hannah Rosen, I think, maybe? There was a story in the New Republic that I could have done without. Or maybe it was just the editors. Anyway, some clever New Republic editor or writer decided to call me Dan Quayle's brain, which was both unfair and inaccurate and made my life slightly difficult for a few weeks there in the White House.
In what way did it make it
Well, actually, Dan Quayle was great about it. I mean, he knew that I hadn't put anyone up to this, and he was used to, at this point, he was used to being unjustly accused, and he was gracious about it. But, other staffers, couldn't help but make fun of me a little bit, and I don't blame them. No, people were tolerant of it. It did no great damage.
When did you first meet Rupert Murdoch?
I think I first met Rupert Murdoch when the Bush administration got voted out of office in November '92, and we all vacated the White House in January of '93. I did a little project for the Bradley Foundation for a few months, and then decided maybe I could start something called the Project for the Republican Future, which I did and ran it for about a year and a half, and throughout '94 and early '95. Rupert gave some money to the Project for the Republican Future in '94, and as I recall, through a mutual friend of ours, Erwin Stelzer, I was able to go see Rupert Murdoch and ask him for some support for this effort to revitalize the Republican Party and defeat Hillary Clinton's health care plan and help Republicans possibly win a majority in Congress in '94, which worked out okay. And so he was a donor to the Project for the Republican Future, and I think that's when I first met him.
Is he a Republican?
You know, we've never discussed that. I sort of, he may be registered as an independent, but as he himself has said, he's moderately conservative. I think his political heroes are Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher,
So how then did it lead to the Weekly Standard publication, and what year did you start that?
We started the Standard in '95. The first publication, the first issue, was Labor Day of 1995. I went to Rupert, Fred Barnes, who was then at the New Republic, and was interested in the idea of a new conservative weekly based in Washington. John Pat Horowitz, who was then at the New York Post and who had a lot of magazine and newspaper experience, and I got together and thought, well, let's take a shot at a new conservative weekly magazine based in Washington, basically a conservative version of the New Republic. And I guess I went to Murdoch originally thinking perhaps he would give money to a not-for-profit foundation that could publish the magazine. I would raise money from 6 or 8 or 10 wealthy individuals and put it together and get them to support it. And he said, well, look, I have some experience in publishing. Maybe I'll just publish it. We'll just publish it out of News Corp. And so that worked out well, and we got editorial independence and the support of News Corp, and it's been a happy marriage for over 10 years.
Has it ever made any money?
No.
Do you have any requirements to make money?
Well, no, since if we did, we'd be out of business, and we're not. We have a requirement to be serious about the budget and to try to reduce the deficit, and we have, and to not be profligate, obviously. And I'd love to make money. It's just hard. Small journals of opinion, even medium-sized journals of opinion, we have 100,000 subscribers or so. It's just hard to make money in that business.
How many people work there?
I think 28, counting everyone from receptionist to business side to editors and writers.
And you say you have close to 100,000 circulation?
Yeah, I think it's about 90,000 paid circulation to the print edition, and then of course a lot of people read it online as well. Many of them reading some of the material which is made available free.
Who do you know that reads it every week that matters to you? Just an example of an individual that you know reads it all the time.
My parents. They're good critics, and I respect their judgment, and they, I think, find most of it worth reading most of the time, and that's all you can ask for when you put out a magazine.
When do you talk to them about it?
Well, they get it on Sunday. They get there on the VIP home delivery list, as well they should be. They deserve to be. And well, they don't call up every week and say, like this, didn't like that. But in the course of the week when we're chatting, sometimes my mother will mention that she liked this review or didn't think this piece was quite as strong as some other piece on a similar topic. But they've always been supportive and complimentary. And since they both have a lot of experience in magazines and in intellectual affairs, I very much respect their judgment. My wife has always been a good critic and a supportive critic of the magazine. But actually, lots of people, though, have made interesting comments, I guess, about the magazine. I'm struck by the world of magazine readers is an interesting world, and lots of people like things you didn't think they would like and appreciate parts of the magazine that you might not have thought they would appreciate. Pat Moynihan, when he was alive, and I worked for him years before, and we were friends, not close, but, acquaintances and friends. Pat loved the back of the book of the Weekly Standard, or so he told me. The last phone conversation I had with Pat Moynihan, he called up and he was ill, and I think he was calling because my father had an operation to see how he was doing, and then we were chatting, and he told me how much he loved a review Joseph Epstein had done of a new biography of Max Beerbohm, the British writer from the mid-century, I guess, whom Pat turns out to have idolized as a youth. And, who would think that a U.S. senator would be reading Joseph Epstein's reviews of a biography, a Joseph Epstein review of a biography of Max Beerbohm. But I've found that people appreciate, you can't predict what people will like necessarily or what will interest people in a magazine. All you can do is try to put out good material and let people make their own judgments.
Time slot, we used to have book notes, and your father appeared on here in 1995, and I want to show the clip from 95 and get you to talk about what he talks about.
Okay.
It refers to a constellation of opinions and views that is not traditionally conservative, but is conservative, and is certainly not liberal. And since I and others who have been called neoconservatives move from being liberals to being a kind of conservative, then neoconservatism seemed like a pretty good term.
How do you fit into the neoconservative label?
Well, I'm proud to accept it. A lot of my favorite people have been called neoconservatives, like my father, so I'm happy to be called one as well. I mean, I never thought, that term was used during the 70s and 80s really for my father's generation, for people who had been liberals, mostly Cold War, anti-communist liberals, who became conservative, or in any case, liberals moved left, and there they were defending old-fashioned liberalism in the late 60s, early 70s. And also we thought some issues and developed some new ideas, I think, in economic policy and cultural issues. And so I never particularly thought of myself as a neoconservative. I was just a conservative. You know, I supported Reagan and went to work for Bill Bennett and Reagan and worked for Quayle and started the Project for the Republican Future and worked with Gingrich. But the irony is, in the last few years, the term has come roaring back and has been applied to me and to the foreign policy that I and others have argued for, and I'm happy to accept it. And I do accept it, and I think it does capture something about the way I and some of my colleagues think about politics. It's probably a little different from traditional conservatives, but as my father said, is certainly not liberal in the current sense of that word.
How old's your dad today?
He is 86.
And how's he doing?
He's doing great, thank you. He's really doing fine.
You grew up what street on the Upper West Side of New York?
I grew up at 81st and Riverside.
What was the family like then? What were your parents doing?
Let's see, well, in the 60s, which is when I was in elementary school, and well, when I was in school, elementary school, junior high, and high school, my father, for most of that time, was I guess, vice president of Basic Books, a publishing house. He had been years before an editor of commentary. He had gone to England and started and edited Encounter magazine, really a great magazine in the 50s in Great Britain. I had lived there as a little kid, very little kid. We had come back in, I think, 1958 or 59, and lived in New York, and he was in book publishing, but he wrote for various journals. He was associated with Commentary and many other journals of opinion. He and Dan Bell started the Public Interest in 1965, the quarterly that had 40 years of very distinguished publication and stopped publication just a year ago. My mother was a historian, had written a couple of books already, but began teaching again after my sister and I were sort of old enough that we didn't need much attention. I guess around 1964 she began teaching at the City University of New York. So I grew up in a semi-academic, semi-journalistic household, I would say. You
mentioned Commentary. Norman Podhoretz was running that a few years ago, and his son John Podhoretz and you started the Weekly Standard.
Right.
Did you know Norman Podhoretz when you were growing up?
Yeah, I knew Norman Podhoretz and his wife, Midge Decter. They were friends of my parents. I actually didn't know, John's younger than I am, so I didn't know, we kids didn't know each other particularly well. I'm sure we met a few times, but no, so I met John again really as an adult in Washington.
And he's now at the New York Post.
He's a columnist at the New York Post.
Your mother appeared on Book Notes a couple of years. I don't remember the exact date, but let's see what she looks like and what she was talking about there. And your son is?
And my son is Bill Kristol. William Kristol, otherwise known as Bill Kristol, who's always identified as the Republican strategist. I'm not sure I know what that means.
And your husband you give a lot of credit to in this book as you started out, saying you almost can't give him enough credit. And who is your husband?
Irving Kristol, who's a writer and editor and publisher, and who's acquired the tag, the label of the godfather of neoconservatism.
So what does that make you?
It makes me the wife of Irving Kristol and the mother of Bill Kristol, is what it makes me.
Are you a Republican strategist or a neoconservative?
I'm not a Republican strategist. In private life, I suppose I'd be a neoconservative. As far as my writing goes, I'm simply a historian.
What impact did Gertrude Himmelfarb have on your life?
Well, I'm sure a lot. I mean, it's so hard, to disentangle the impact on one's own life, and many people have paid psychiatrists huge amounts of money to establish that. No, I think a real respect for serious intellectual pursuits. My mother was and is a very distinguished historian and really wrote, especially when I was growing up, she didn't write about contemporary issues at all. She wrote about intellectual history of the 19th century, John Stuart Mill, Darwin, Lord Acton, a huge volume, 2 major volumes on the idea of poverty in late 19th century Britain. So I think a respect for the life of the mind, for serious scholarship, for real intellectual work.
Last week on this program, we had Karen Kataski, a retired lieutenant colonel in the Air Force, who worked in the Pentagon in the South Asia Near East Policy Group. And we asked her to talk about being